Shabbat shalom, everyone. Apologize for that. Welcome. And just wanted to say that I'm glad once again to be able to spend a Shabbat with you guys and be able to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been learning and of course, see what direction the Father takes us, right? At any rate, we are going to go ahead and probably get started pretty quick here. However, I did want to go ahead and put out a global prayer request, basically something to communicate to YouTube and also to our people on Zoom to pray for my friend Terry. He's going through a lot of stuff in his physical health, and he could really use your prayers. So, and just to give you an idea of who he is, if you go and search for Terry Hancock on the NASA website, that's his photograph behind me. At any rate, figured I would make a global prayer request for him, and I appreciate your kindness there. So there's a lot to cover today. Okay. We're going to try to build a foundation to try to change some paradigms, of course. And of course, as you know, we've been going through this evolution. We've been going through these stages of change in this ministry as we've begun to discover some very important facts. Now, there's a couple things that are important here. The first of which, it is necessary to understand that what we think we understand about the ancient peoples, we have based upon archaeological digs, we've based upon, trying to find things that would indicate that they had any type of civilization advancement. Okay. So majority of the time we attribute the word ancient to primitive. And when we talk about the word primitive, we're talking about something that's a little bit closer to the origin of mankind and therefore is supposedly not as advanced. We have in our American social democratic hedonistic lifestyle and mindset a sentiment that we are superior because of the advancements in our knowledge and technology. Well, for a moment, I want you to consider the possibility that that is probably not so accurate. Now, I will say that this is the Hanukkah season, right? And so as a result of that, we do have a reference to that holiday in John chapter 10. Well, in John chapter 10, Yeshua discussing the Psalms, and specifically Psalm 82, makes a statement in which he says the scripture cannot be broken. Okay. Now, although there is definitely a breakdown in translation as we go from, for example, Greek back to Aramaic, Aramaic back to Hebrew, then we are actually encountering elements of breakdown in translation. What do I mean by that? What something means in Hebrew doesn't necessarily perfectly translate over into English. But let's say for a minute we give some precedence to King Solomon in the English Bible. Well, it doesn't really matter it doesn't really matter what translation or what version of the Bible you use. All of them say the same thing. What has been is what will be. What does that mean? That means that whatever we're encountering today in science and technology and the use of materials has been. I know that's a disturbing thought, because then we start to get into, whoa, what kind of technology did they have, right? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's a sentiment that is an unfortunate sentiment that there was not a great knowledge with the people who created the ancient Hebraic pictographs. There's a few reasons why this is important, but one of the biggest is that what evolution has been going on in this ministry is the discovery that some of the ancient pictographic parent roots, which we'll talk about in a minute, don't mean what the drawings indicate. Okay. And as a result of that, we've begun to discover a whole new area of knowledge that we can tap into. Well, there's a few reasons why this is important, but the biggest reason why in any of this is that we need to remember that when Yahweh began his operation with human beings in covenantal process, he used the Hebrew language. Hebrew language is one of the only languages that contains a built-in gematria. Hebrew language is one of the only languages that contains a built-in reversal and therefore sometimes opposite of letters. You switch the letters around and the word means the opposite of what it was. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. I really want to accent the Hebrew language a little bit because I want to communicate something very important. The narratives, the stories, the folklore about Jesus Christ, about Yeshua HaMashiach, it's not written in Greek. It was not written by a Greek. And Yeshua did not speak Greek to his fellow Jews. Case in point, they're at Caesarea Philippi, right? Caesarea Philippi is famous for having this area that kind of looks down into the lava flows, and therefore is considered to be the gates of hell. Okay, the gates of Hades, specifically the gates of Hades. It was a Roman area of worship, but also Greeks. And basically the idea is that it was kind of like this powerful place because of the volcanic activity that was going on there. Yeshua takes Peter and the disciples up there, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And of course he says, "Thou art the Christ." And he says, "Simon Bar-Jonah, you have not received that by your own word, but by the voice of my Father within you," right? Calling him a prophet. He just spoke the words of God. And he says, "And upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it." Okay, let me make something abundantly clear. Hades is a Greek mythological character, not a location. And the underworld that Hades controlled is a Greek mythological pantheon story. Why is that important? It's mythology. So you have the intensification of all power in the universe stuffing himself into a human being and coming down and talking about a mythological fictional story. A story that is not true, and then saying that the gates of Hades are not going to prevail against it. That's proof that your gospels were not written in Greek. Not to mention the fact that Hades is a god and a foreign god, a false god, and it says in Deuteronomy, "Do not let the names of other gods be on your lips." And so Yeshua is violating Torah. He was in all ways tempted and did not sin, and therefore he what? Didn't say Hades. He didn't. So this is an example of a breakdown, right? But the reason why it's so important is because you need to understand that your Messiah spoke Hebrew and he practiced an ancient Hebraic lifestyle. And if you are Christian and you are Christ-like, then you should probably look into the lifestyle he practiced and look into the commandments that he was obedient to. And in addition to that, you need to let go of the Greek. You need to let go of the Gentile Christian identity and accept that at the time in which Peter and Paul were on the scene, people converted to Judaism in order to become a part of the faith. It's an anti-Semitic thought process that it's anything other than that. You say, well, you probably ride the anti-Semitic soapbox too much. That may be true, but I think that there is a necessity to understand that there is a belief that the Jews cannot be trusted with the information that is conveyed, including Josephus, who is probably one of our biggest proof texts for some of the things that I teach and talk about when it comes to Yeshua or when it comes to the antiquities of the Jews. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. We'll go ahead and we'll get on to the whiteboard for a minute, and we'll start documenting some things and explaining some things. But it's important in this process that we begin to see how things play out in terms of sight, in terms of observation. Okay, so let's go ahead and we will jump into our whiteboard and go from there. Okay, let's see. So let's do Hebrew in orange today. We use that and we will use that. Okay. All right. So starting at the very beginning, let's talk a minute about a normal Hebrew word. Let's just say that we use this word right here. It is a popular word to explain grammar when we are dealing with students teaching them Hebrew. Okay. And this is the word katal, which means to kill. But the reason why it's a good word is because when I say a good word for teaching grammar is because it doesn't contain a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, and the last letter isn't doubled, so it doesn't get any type of special treatments when it comes to conjugations. Let me explain conjugations for a second. Conjugations are basically a partially gender-related and also tense-related treatment of a verb. For example, in English, if I say the word cook, okay, that's a noun that means somebody who prepares food, correct? But it also is the infinitive or the without beginning or end an ongoing action of the English language, right? To cook, right? Which is a verb. But if I say I am going to cook, then I'm using it in the infinitive. But if I've completed it, I've cooked, which means what? I have conjugated that word by what? Adding the ed suffix. Well, in Hebrew, you have suffixes, infixes, and prefixes that alter the tense of the word, okay? But they also alter the gender of the word, which is very complicated compared to English. There's a few reasons why this is important, and I'm about to show you what those are, okay? So let's go ahead and get back to our whiteboard. Okay, so this is the word katal, right, to kill. But if I was to take and I was to move this over just a little bit, and I was then going to add a vav, this goes from to kill to killing or killer, okay, just by adding the vav. So this is an example of adding an infix in order to conjugate the verb. So what have I done? I've gone from it being the Hebrew masculine singular past tense or what we call perfect action. which is that it's completed. So it's literally this right here is he killed. But when I add the vav, all of a sudden it becomes a participle. It becomes an ing. So it is killer or killing, ongoing action with a beginning, okay, and with an end. So the point that I'm making is, in order for you to read Hebrew, you have to learn how to get rid of the infixes, suffixes, and prefixes, meaning we get it back to this form, which is what? It is 1, 2, 3 letters. This is called the lexical form, okay? The lexical form, or lexical root, we'll call it. Now, when it comes to the Strong's Concordance, this is as far back as you're going to go, okay? But in in an anthropological civilized, when you're seeking the civilization of an ancient people, or when you're seeking information through archaeology, the discovery is that this is not as far back as it goes, that there is actually a higher up root than this. So the lexical root, whether you're in the Brown Drivers Briggs, the Genesius, or in the let's say I think it's the Brenton Hebrew lexicon, and then also, of course, the Strong's Concordance and the Young's Literal Concordance. All of them are going to have this, and they're going to stop here. Okay. Now, there's a reason why this is important. What's behind me doesn't tell you a story. And the story that's being told, that we're beginning to discover, does not contain the information that you need. Now, I know that sounds messed up, because you are an English speaker, most likely. In fact, if you're not an English speaker, you're probably having a hard time with this YouTube channel right now. But what's my point? If I start speaking Hebrew, you're not going to understand. Now, a Hebrew who was born a Hebrew, who understands Hebrew, will understand. And it won't translate well, okay? But the premise is that even if I was to start speaking Greek, you still wouldn't understand. Aramaic, you still wouldn't understand. What's my point? You are a part of something that is going to require you to either A, trust somebody who speaks the language to translate for you, or learn the language. Why, you ask? I'll tell you why. Because as I've said before, your Gospels were not written in Greek. They were copied to Greek from Aramaic, most likely, or directly from Hebrew. But what we do know is they're not written in Greek. They are copies of copies, and there's thousands of them. When we are dealing with the Old Testament, which unfortunately is another anti-Semitic term, we are dealing with Hebrew. And when we're dealing with Hebrew, there's not a whole lot of distance between what needs to be understood about a verse and what it actually says in the scroll. But here's the problem. You can't actually translate Hebrew into English, because Hebrew has some very unique attributes. So I'll start with the understanding that it is an idiomatic language. It's a language of symbols, and we're going to get into the importance of that in a minute. When we're dealing with a language of symbols, you need to understand that what it says is not what it means. So it can say what it says and translate that into English, but you have no idea. Let me give you an example. If I say something like, for example, hit the ball out of the park, okay? That is a figure of speech, right? That is an idiom. What's it mean? Well, it has to do with American baseball, which is an adaptation of an English version of it. And so, really, when we're dealing with this, we have to be American to understand hit the ball out of the park. The reason why that's important is because then you can understand what the context of the idiom is. What is the context of the idiom hit the ball out of the park? It means you did a really good job, right? You nailed it. What was it originally in the literal is somebody hitting the ball so hard that they hit it out of the park. Nobody can catch it. Nobody can retrieve it. And if the bases are loaded, that's a bunch of points, right? If the bases are loaded, that's home run after home run after home run after home run. You hit the ball out of the park, you have hit a home run. You have gotten a big score. You've gotten a big accomplishment occur. And why is that important? Because anybody who's not American is not going to understand that. Now, since baseball has kind of taken the world by storm, it's a little bit more realistic that they would understand that. But you get somebody who comes out of, say, the Honduras jungle, right? The jungle in Honduras. And now all of a sudden they come to the United States and they are visiting and they hear somebody use that idiom. Are they really probably going to understand what it means? No. Okay. So in that same way, Hebrew uses idioms. Here's the problem. I can say, you have done an exceptional job. I can say to a person who has done something really well, you've done an exceptional job. Or I could say, dude, you hit the ball out of the park, right? Either way, they understand what I'm saying. Well, here's the problem with Hebrew. Hebrew will use hit the ball out of the park every time and won't actually use the literal words. You'll never hear it say, you did an excellent job. It'll always say they hit the ball out of the park. That's the difference between English and Hebrew. Now, the reason why that is significant is because when we get into the idiomatic understanding of Hebrew, then we start to understand that the language is not a very literal language. This is why it can't be translated. Which means either A, you're going to have to trust somebody who can interpret it for you, and it probably doesn't actually say what it says. What do I mean by that? It'll literally say, hit the ball out of the park. And if you just translate that, you'd be like, yeah, right? It doesn't make any sense because it'll be some idiom that you don't understand. And so then you take and translate that into the English and read it literally. And now all of a sudden you have a literal interpretation of something that was originally intended to be figurative. That's the danger of the English Bible. That's the danger of trusting the translation to what? To apply that book to your life. Now, there are critics who are going to watch this and they're going to become enraged with the fact that they have done that the translators have done such a good job of translating it over, blah, blah, blah. You can't do it. It's not possible. Now, here's another problem we have. Another problem we have is those letters behind me aren't actually Hebrew. They're Aramaic. We use Aramaic letters from the first century to what? To write Hebrew, which means now we've lost not only the original character, but we've also lost the original meaning, right? And so you're probably like, well, what's the point here? Why even care about this? Wouldn't God give us a clear path through the English? That is not a question I'm going to answer for you. You need to ask him. But what I do know is that when I went from being a Reformed Protestant Christian who bought into the 5 points of Calvin and rejected Hebrew and rejected Greek with the belief that God had given me the direction that I needed through the English Bible, when he cracked me on the head with a 2x4 and showed me different, I repented. And I repented in tears because of my arrogance and pride. If that be you, then you may want to follow suit. There's a few reasons why this is so important. Number one is the fact that when we are dealing with the people of Israel, we need to understand their lifestyle. In order to really glean a greater process of what they went through, we need to understand who they were, how they operated, how they thought, what their philosophies were, what their theology was. In addition to that, we also need to understand that it's very possible that we have an example that we're supposed to be following that we're not following. And finally, the last reason is because when God made a covenant with a family of people on the earth to be a representation of himself to the rest of the world, you need to understand that that meant that he chose that culture, that language, and that lifestyle. All lifestyle is a practice of culture over time, right? What's culture? A set of beliefs and actions that are carried out by a people that causes them to be unique as a people. Okay, so one of the things that we need to do then is we need to accept that the examples of those who have gone before us. I remember there's this Christian song that I heard a long time ago, I believe it is, either through Hosanna Integrity, if you want to look it up, or it might have been Maranatha, I can't remember what it was. May those who have gone before us find us faithful. And in my brain, I thought about the Hall of Faith, right, in Hebrews chapter 11, and all of the other things, and asked myself, do I reflect this type of a person? Am I like Abraham? Or am I way off, right? And I know there's a danger in compare contrast when it comes to human beings, but I want to kind of explain that in my heart, when I was early in my Christian understanding, I really sought to know whether or not I was as faithful as, say, Newton, right? Who wrote Amazing Grace, or Miller, right? That dude had some faith, or David Livingstone, right? And so there was this greatness to these men and these people, and it was so important to me. Anyways, the point that I'm trying to make is when we start to look at the characters of the Bible, we realize they have a lifestyle. Well, what people don't know is that that lifestyle is the language. What do I mean by that? Hebrew is not a language. There are not linguistic patterns per se that you could pull up and actually make a conclusion on how a conversation went based upon what you see on a papyri. Why? Because of the possibility that idioms are being used that we don't understand. Okay, so I think I have covered that enough to explain that it's very, very difficult to go from Hebrew to English, even though that it seems as though it's easy because you pick up, say, a King James version and boom, you're there, right? You're reading. You've got information coming at you, right? You have these perceptions coming at you about, and you're reading it with your frame of reference and what you've been taught in Christianity. And not only that, but you're reading it with your frame of reference of what you're being offered through the English. Okay. Now, without making any accusations about translational bias, which will absolutely be present, you will translate Hebrew you would translate from Hebrew to English with a belief system in place about what you think is being communicated there. You will. And so if your theology is Trinitarian, if your theology is anti-Semitic, if your theology is antinomian, guess what? You're going to translate it that way. It's going to look like that's what they were saying. Danger, Will Robinson. Okay. And so now when we're getting into this, let's jump back onto our board here. You understand that this lexical root really doesn't necessarily do you a whole lot of good. What do I mean by that? All we did was remove the infix. to get it back to a 3 radical or 3 letter root. Okay? Well, what about this word? This obviously is not what we call a strong verb. This word happens to be the word for light that's translated into the English, right? So up here, so right here, I'll just write light. Okay, this is the word light. But here's the interesting thing about it. This is a lexical root. How do we know? 1, 2, 3. 3 radicals, right? There's no conjugations going on. This is as far back as we can go in most theological seminaries. But what's interesting is that this contains one of these letters, a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or we'll do X as a doubled last letter. This criteria right here is the criteria for what we call a child root. Okay? The reason this is so important is because then what we understand is we can lose that. Now, in the Strong's Concordance, when you encounter the highest or the lexical form of a word like this, it'll say in the Strong's, it'll read like this: from prim root. That means some specific thing. From primitive root, that means such and such. And that's as far back as it will go. Okay. Now, the reason why this is relevant is because this should tell you that there's a parent root. Okay. Primitive root. What do they mean by primitive? It's not used in the scrolls. It's not used in the Hebrew per se. Okay. Which means what? We got to go further back than when the Bible was written. Which means what? We are encountering a people in the beginning of their culture, the beginning of their civilization. Okay. But as promised, I told you that I would use some information to prove to you that actually, in all reality, there is an understanding that there was more advanced knowledge than what we realize. Okay. So I've shown you, by the way, if it doesn't contain these letters. So let's do this. So if it doesn't contain these letters, then it is like this one here, which doesn't contain those letters, an adopted root. Which means it's hard to find the parent. That's all it means. It's hard to find the parent. A child root, you can very easily find the parent. You just eliminate the vav, and then all of a sudden we just have an aleph, and we have a resh, and we can go back to the parent root. But in the case of katal, we would have to do some searching and some research into which one of these letter combinations is the actual parent root. Now, the reason why that's important is because then we understand that there's sometimes where one of these letters, somewhere in these 3 letters, augments the other 2. It alters the state of the original parent root. So those letters are added for very specific reasons. Okay, there's a few reasons why this is important. Number one is obviously we can encounter a letter modifying the rest of the letters. Number two, we can understand that the parent root by itself doesn't necessarily mean the actual adopted root. Okay, so that's a little bit down the rabbit hole. And I know you're probably like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of information. Welcome to the reality of the Bible. See, one of the mistakes that has been made is that there's a simplicity to faith, that there's a simplicity to believing, that there's a simplicity to covenant, and there's a simplicity to our Messiah, and a simplicity to the cross. There isn't. There is always a dynamic. There's nothing static. There's always a dynamic. There's always a movement in the language. There's always a movement in what's going on with the covenants, what's going on with the people, etc. The mistake is trying to pigeonhole it or put it in a box or say that one covenant augments another, or say one covenant cancels another, or say that one covenant adds more blessing than another. That's a misunderstanding of the Hebrew lifestyle. Okay, so now we've gone what? We've gone some levels here. So we've started with what? We've started with Strong's Concordance Lexicon, which is concorded to the King James Version of the Bible. So let's start with the King James Version of the Bible. At the very top, we've got English, and very specifically Old English, right? 1611 English. Then we have James Strong come along in the 18th century, or I'm sorry, in the 1800s, and what? Concord that entire book. What does that mean? If you want to find the word, let's say that we want to use the word tabernacle, you can find every instance of the word tabernacle in the Old and the New Testament with Strong's Concordance. And he takes it back to what's called a lexical root. The lexical root is what? The root that is not conjugated. What's a conjugation? It's a modification of gender and tense, okay, and potentially mood, but we're not going to get into mood today. So the principle is that in all of that, now what we have is this idea that that's as far as seminary is going to teach your pastor to go. Now, I have nothing against pastors. I think they're beautiful people, and dear God, do they carry a load. And I pray that every one of them is brought to an understanding of how to best care for their flock. I pray they prosper. And in my mind, I don't count them as heretics. I don't count them as people who are destructive, but the pulpit itself, which is what? All their knowledge that they gained is destructive, is anti-Semitic, is antinomian. We were warned about it in Scripture from Paul. We were warned about it in Scripture from Peter. We were warned about it in Isaiah. We were warned about it in the Psalms, and we were warned about it in Torah. Now, so Strong's Concordance, lexical root, that's level. So what do we got? We've got English Bible, King James, Strong's Concordance, lexical roots. Then we've got child roots and we've got adopted roots, and that's how far we've gone so far. There is a big reason why I need you to grasp the level here, okay? Because I need you to understand how far away we really are from understanding what we need to understand. Okay, so the next place that we need to go then is to ask the question, well, if there's a child root and there's an adopted root, then there must be a parent root. So I'm going to go ahead and move to another page, and we will discuss this. I want you to think about orphans. I want you to think about that they don't have a parent, and that there's Hebrew words who have lost their path back to the depth of understanding. Okay, so we're gonna get into that. But in this case, the word that we're going to come up with or use in this instance is going to be the word may. Okay, that is the English word unclean. Okay, that's the English word unclean. Now, when we talk about uncleanness, there is a lot that needs to be understood, because we can start out with a literal understanding of uncleanness, But remember, this is an idiomatic language. And so when we're starting out with the word unclean, you need to think about mud on your hands. Okay. So you go and you get some mud on your hands. Now you need to what? Wash. When you have the mud on your hands, you're unclean. When you don't have the mud on your hands, you're clean. The mechanism by which you become clean or remove the dirt is washing. Okay. Now watch how this works. This is the lexical root right here. It doesn't go back any further than that in the Strongs. Okay. That is the lexical root. And it to you means unclean. Okay. However, it contains what? It contains a yod, a hey, a vav, an aleph, or a doubled last letter. What does it contain? It contains the aleph. So we're just going to eliminate the aleph. And we're going to now say that the actual parent root is what? Tet. And we'll use the final mem just to be on track. Okay? That has no meaning and is not written in any of the scrolls anywhere this way. Okay? Tet mem doesn't exist. However, in ancient pottery from the excavations in Babylon, the Middle East, and Turkey, and also the United States, which I'll get into that another day, this, you know what? Let's do it this way. This is what you would find, which is what? What are these things? Well, we have been able to find out through various extrapolations of ancient languages and pictographs, either from Egyptian hieroglyphics or from the Sumerian or Akkadian language in the cuneiform pictographs, not the cuneiform words, but the cuneiform pictographs, that this is a basket. Now, here's the problem. A basket does not hold water, which means what? We need to accept that this is possibly a container. A container. Okay? A container. Well, what's this? This is water. It's a drawing of water. In fact, it's in so many different languages. And it's in the ancient Chinese. It's in the let me switch this over to the board. It's in the ancient Chinese. It's in the Native American culture. It's in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. And what is this? A container of water. What does a container of water offer? A way to wash. So this is an example of a breakdown in an understanding of the English versus what it actually says in the Hebrew. Wash, right? So when you become unclean, no, that's not what it says. It says when it is necessary to wash. Got me? Okay. And so that's an example of a parent root. It's a 2-letter root. But notice I went from the Aramaic letters. Remember, we don't even have we're not even using the Hebrew letters right now. The scrolls are written with Aramaic letters, right? To pictographs. And the pictographs tell a different story than what the word is actually being translated in the English, even in Jewish texts. Now, there's one of two reasons that could happen. Either A, it's just easier to understand that way, or B, there is an evolution of words. Think about the word bad, right, in English. The word bad in English is supposed to indicate when something is not good or when it's not right. But how many of you, when you see a nice car, say that's a bad car, right? Or that's a mean car? That's a form of evolution on the word bad. Okay, so there's one or two reasons why the word unclean goes from being a washing process to being a dirty process, right? Okay, so now when we are dealing with parent roots, now we understand that there's a possibility that there's an idiomatic understanding of that parent root. However, when we get into the ancient pictographic Hebrew, we have to take some things into consideration. So what are the things we have to take into consideration? These were nomadic people, right? So let me switch over here. These were nomadic people. And nomadic people were what? Shepherds. Which means you're going to get a lot of what? Symbols about sheep and their process. Okay. So they're shepherds. There were also warrior clans, which means what? We're going to get a lot of warrior symbols. What else? They were nomadic, which means what? They were tent dwellers. So the tent is another big idiom, right? The tent, which is what? Symbols of provision, protection, and instruction. Or their opposites, right? So expect to see this in scripture because that's the type of people they were. That was their culture. Their culture is what? A practice of their beliefs in a form of action that makes them unique from another people. Okay? That's the key here. So one of the reasons this is important is because then you can understand that if there were pictographs being used, if there were pictographs being used in a certain way, it would have to do with their philosophies. It would have to do with their theologies. It would have to do with their knowledge. Let me show you what I mean. So now moving over to our illustration of the, okay, I'm going to see, I'm going to do this one, we will do blue. And this one will do green. This one will do, yeah. Okay. So remember this drawing, right? Remember we have the sea, we have the waves, and then we have the sun behind, right? And then we have the dude on the beach with his hands raised up, looking at this amazing sight. And there's an element of fear and awe, right? There's an element of fear and awe because why? Because it is bigger than him. It is more powerful than him. That sounds pretty primitive, right? That sounds like, I don't know. There's an element of where these guys are kind of like cave dwellers, right? That's what they are, right? And so we have this idea of the, we have this idea of this, the sun, right, setting. And so there's kind of this intensification of light, right? Sun is setting behind the sea. I don't know if you guys have ever seen it before. I mean, and there's even legends of this flash of light right before the sun drops behind the horizon. and scientists have included it's something to do with the atmosphere or whatever. Point is that there's this intensity that occurs at sunset on the ocean. And so this Hebrew is looking out over that, and what? He draws this drawing right here. Well, that kind of looks like it, right? I mean, we have, if we were to kind of illustrate it a little bit, here's our water, right? And here is the sun above the horizon. And here's the sun reflected off the water. So we can see how this pictograph makes sense, right? This is a Hebrew looking west over the Mediterranean, looking at his world, and he draws a circle and draws a line through it as the sun at the horizon. So you would expect that this pictograph or this Hebrew letter would have something to do with the sun, or would have something to do with the horizon, or with water, or with the beach, or with something sparkly, right? It would have something to do with light, maybe, right? Because it's what? The drawing of the sun at sunset. Okay. What does it mean? What is the actual pictograph mean? When we take all of the stems, let me explain stems for a minute. Child and adopted roots combined into a group together that have the same parent root are stems. And stems are basically words that all have kind of an overtone meaning to them, but don't actually have necessarily a connection back to the parent root per se. Some of the parent roots have been extrapolated from the common theme from all the stems. Okay. Well, what's interesting about this letter is that whenever it is used, what it does not mean, it doesn't mean horizon. So I'm just going to go ahead and write that up there, right? It doesn't mean horizon. Let me switch back over here. Doesn't mean horizon. Doesn't mean beach, right? Oh, goodness. It doesn't mean beach. Has nothing to do with water. Has nothing to do with light. Has nothing to do with chaos, which is one of our idiomatic understandings of the sea. Has nothing to do with the sunset. It means none of those things. None of these. Okay? So we're just going to go like this. It doesn't mean any of those. Do you know what it means? Condense. Condense. As in to intensify in density. Okay. Now, this is where I'm going to prove to you that the ancients were not stupid. They were not ignorant, and they were not primitive. They may not have had printed circuit boards. Maybe they did. We just can't find them because they've completely deteriorated. Who knows? But they had a knowledge that we don't give them credit for, because watch this. They drew this right here, right? They drew that symbol. They drew a number of things here, but the biggest and most important one would be a black hole, the event horizon of a black hole, which is the greatest condensation of matter, period. Okay. But let's say that we go ahead and let that go, and we'll say that that there's no way they could have known that, right? Let's go with that, and let's let that go. Because remember, it's the word condense, right? When condensation is the gathering. And where do we get the idea of condensation? We get the idea of condensation, or the increase in density of what? Of water. Okay. And water condensing becomes clouds, and clouds then drop rain. We understand that process. You take and you put you boil a pot of water, and you put a glass lid over the top. And what happens? It turns into a rain cloud. And you see what? You see the steam collect on top of it, and it turn into little droplets, and those droplets drop back into the water. Condensation at its finest, right? But the idea of the increasing of density, and that being attributed to the sunset, begs question, doesn't it? Okay. So now we're going to just go ahead and move our little symbol out of the way here. We're just going to put it over here. And I'm going to talk to you a minute about the sun. So our sun is obviously our sun is a ball of fire, right? That has a very specific thing going on inside of it, which is what? Fusion, right? What is going on with fusion? There is a gravitational pull of dense materials into each other. They fuse, and from that create an intensity of heat. The heat produces light energy, heat energy, and radioactive energy because of the two atoms that are coming together, which is basically an isotope of hydrogen, which means what? We have deuterium and tritium in their densest form fusing and creating this intense energy. Okay. So there's literally condensation occurring in the sun. What does that mean? What is so important about that? Like, why would that be relevant? What is the reason why I took all of this time to explain this? Because you need to understand that a lot of people have worked hard to establish a theology and understanding. We have the Westminster Confession. We have the confession. I can't remember the name of it that Luther came up with. We have all kinds of theologies and understandings coming together, and then decisions being made that this is the standard. But the problem is that there is a big piece of the puzzle being missed. And unfortunately, the theologies have pagan influence. The theologies have bias. The theologies have a mistrust of the Jews, and the theologies have also a what? A belief that who cares what the ancient Hebrew says? I have an English Bible. That's what God gave me because I'm an American. Well, I cannot tell you how off you are in your understanding when it comes to the covenant that you're supposedly a part of. Because in all of the understanding of that covenant, the new covenant, you are Hebrew. Part of the renewing and beholding you have become new is that you have stepped into the family of God. Welcome to Israel if you are grafted in. I'm not going to get into or soapbox the issue of why it would be important to understand that if God has an expectation for a human being in one area of history and punishes that human being for his disobedience through that expectation, and he goes now to the future and offers that a person get away with it, that's an unjust God. Now, we could get into the sovereignty of God and that what right have we to ask? But then the next question is if he gave us free will, are we really actually choosing him, or are we being forced into this circumstance? Okay. Those are not questions we necessarily need to answer today. However, now you see, I've brought you through this. We've gone from King James to lexical root, to parent root, to cosmic meaning of pictographs, impossible knowledge. Do you know what it took for us to discover that the sun was actually producing tritium and deuterium? We actually had to have an understanding of the spectrum of color. We had to have an understanding of radiation. We had to have an understanding of isotopes, which we didn't discover until what? I don't know, what was it, the 30s, maybe 1900s? We had to have an understanding, it might have been 1800s. We had to have an understanding of the speed of light, the speed of sound. We had to have an understanding of a vacuum. We had to have an understanding of relativity just to understand what they said in one pictograph. So have some humility when it comes to thinking that they were ignorant. That's one of the things that the pulpit has taught you, is that they were ignorant of what they were doing. David was ignorant. Abraham was ignorant. Okay, now, in that process now, what we need to do is we need to start to look at some of the important pictographs that we have been working with. And the reason for that is because of what this message is about. This message is about perception. This message is about having preconceived notions and applying those preconceived notions and opinions to your experience of life. I'm going to show you what I mean. So let's get back to our board. Okay, so moving on to another page. What do we need to do here? Well, we need to recap a little bit. So I'm going to remind you guys that in the Hebrew, when we hear in Psalm 22, the Lord is my shepherd, right? I shall not want. It is coming from this word right here. But then in Isaiah 45:7, when it says, I, the Lord, what? Create darkness and form light. I create what? I create evil and I make shalom. It is the same word. It is the same letters. This is the lexical root of the word friend. Oops. Of the word friend, not freed, and the word evil. You say, how is that possible? Well, it has to do with this letter right here. So when we are looking at this, then what we need to do is we need to realize that this letter actually splits into two letters. The name of the letter is Ayin, which means I, okay? Which means I, or the seer of the body, the thing that is receiving sight, okay? So in this case, we have the I. And that I is drawn like this in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. No shock there, right? Nothing hard there. And so if we were to pull this letter down, this, of course, is the drawing of a human head. And this is no, in any way, depiction of any specific individual. Okay, and so we have the drawing of the human head. So we can have what? We have I, or we can have head watches, right? Head watches. And so a combination, let's do different color here. Combination of this and this becomes what? Watcher of man. Watcher of man, which is what, a friend? What comes from the ancient understanding of what? A shepherd, right? But what do we have? We have another thing here, right? We have this other branch. Okay. So when we're looking at this other branch, that's where we get the actual drawing of the letter from this symbol right here. Actually, let's do that. Okay. And this is what? A twisted rope. Why is that important? That's important because what? Of what the word evil means in the English. Let's talk about this. In English, evil is badness. Evil is when somebody is not good. But what is an American social democratic hedonistic understanding of the word evil? Anything that is contrary to social majority agreement of how things should be, and also somebody who could potentially be somebody who violates what? Your rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That is how we would think of evil. When a person is just sinister and they have no remorse, that's evil, right? But what's the ancient pictographic understanding of evil? And does it matter that we don't have the right definition? That's another question we need to ask. So let's go back into this for a minute. And what do we have? We have the idea. Oh my gosh. Let's see. Let's fix this a little bit here. Okay. So we have this twisted rope, right? We have this twisted rope, and the connection between these two is what? Head or man twisted. Okay. So then what we need to do is then ask, what is the twisting of the head? Well, there's a few ways we could look at this. We could look at this literally, that it's when somebody looks away from the direction that they're going. And so there's a deviation from the path, or at least in thought, or at least literally. They see something, and that's not going. First of all, there's not very many people who are going to continue walking forward while they're looking at something else. Unless, of course, you have your cell phone, then it's a different story, because people have the conclusion that they can actually peripherally navigate while they're using a phone. Please don't do that. Okay, so the principle is that you're looking over here. Okay, that would be the literal understanding. A more figurative understanding would be that there's something wrong up here, right? Now, if we take the American understanding of the English King James Version evil, we are what? We're in the realm of heresy. We're in the realm of psychopathic behavior. We're in the realm of dark behavior. Now, if we were to accept that the ancient Hebrews understood something more than what we would expect, like the condensation of tritium and deuterium, then we need to accept that they possibly had also an understanding of psychology, that they had an understanding of the science of the mind. But here's something very important. You need to remember that it was no shock to people for an angel to show up and talk to them. We very rarely have an angel show up and be like, hey, what's up? And then be like, oh, whoa, why? Let me get a picture. Get my phone. Hold on, wait. Selfie, right? No, they go, hey, how's it going, man? What you up to? Right? They communicate with them as if it was no shock for them to show up. There's an angel standing over Jerusalem with a sword, ready to destroy Jerusalem. And David walks up, buys land, does a sacrifice, and never skips a beat that there's a thing standing over Jerusalem. Those of you who have been to Jerusalem, it was standing over Jerusalem with a sword, ready to whack somebody on the head. There's no shock to them, which means what? We have a very different understanding of the cosmos and the world around us when it comes to, for lack of better words, magic, energy, and spirituality, the supernatural, the connection between the energy of God and the physical reality of a human being. That is important. So when we get our translation of evil, which you find even in the Chumash, you'll find it in Jewish texts, the word evil is used instead of what that word actually comes out to mean in terms of process. It is what? It is a violation of natural order processes. It is literally the idea that a human is not operating in their full capacity, that something has caused their head to turn away from the path. That's another thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking about symbols that you'll encounter. The path. Remember the idea that Noah walked with God? There's a walking, there's a path, there's a line to be held and walked upon. In fact, the word Satan itself means the thorn that continually causes you to turn off of the path. So when we are dealing with this, now you understand that you can't use the word evil anymore. If you are referring to those words in the King James Version of the Bible that say evil, you are actually referring to a twisted head. Now, applying modern understanding, giving them the benefit of the doubt, but applying modern understanding to the process of what a twisted head would be, we can conclude that it is somebody who has what? Who has started to alter their perception of reality, where they begin to be paranoid or they begin to feel like they are grandiose. What do I mean by that? I mean that the ego takes over and there's a moment in which humans are either something to be exploited or something to be defended against. In other words, you will identify and look at a human and think in your mind, that person is somebody who I have to protect myself from. Or you will look in your mind and say, that person is somebody who I can take advantage of. And I promise you, before you start getting a self-righteous attitude, thinking that you don't take advantage of people, I will totally expose you. You do a one-on-one with me and I will show you how bad you really are in your manipulations. But I can tell you this, that is the twisted head. That is the twisted mind. That is your face off the path. Why is this so important? Because if they understood the condensation of the sun, then they understood the spiritual ramifications of a twisted head and concluded that that was something bad enough to eventually translate into what we call evil. When the truth is that it's just dysfunction. It's a dysfunctional mind. Well, why would that be so important? That would be so important only if you accept that Abraham, the father of all who believed, whether circumcised or uncircumcised, understood metaphysics, understood the connection between the supernatural energy and the physical realm, understood why things happened the way they did, understood that he could take 318 men up against 5 kingdoms. Kingdoms that are estimated to be around 10,000 apiece, 10,000 men apiece, 10,000 troops apiece, 318 men, and took control of all 5 kingdoms. It is very important to understand that the way we think about things is very different from the way they thought about things. But what's interestingly enough is they understood already what we're just now discovering. It's only been 100 some years since we started to understand the atom the way that we really need to. And all of a sudden, here we are at the quantum level discovering that, oh man, we were wrong about that too. Which means now what we're starting to gain and glean an understanding of is the idea that maybe we need to change our paradigm in thinking about how science works. But the truth is that as we continue to exclude the mythology, because that's what your faith is called to somebody who does not believe, a scientist who is an atheist, says that your sky daddy and your sky daddy religion and your processes are all a neurosis, which Freud agreed with him. And so since Freud agreed with him, then that's proof right there, right? But the irony is that that's not what you read in scripture, and yet you continue to live how you live. You still don't understand evil. And the irony of that is that if you still don't understand evil, then you don't understand what's wrong with you. Because what is theology presented to you? Theology is presented to you. Seminary has sent people to stand in front of you, and you sit in pews and face them, and they tell you that you were born to go to hell. But now that you have accepted Christ, you no longer are going to hell, and everything is okay. And it doesn't really matter because everything's horrible in this world, but eventually you're going to die, and then you're going to have bliss. And so as a result of that, we've got people who are just waiting to die. Well, what is that going to contribute to society? And then you've got people who are willing to live their lives. Why? Because they have children, and they have children, and they have property, and they have responsibilities. So of course they're going to live their life, right? There's not a whole lot of people who are just going to end their lives because they want to get to heaven. In fact, the church made sure to tell them that if you do end your life, you're not going to heaven, even if you have accepted Christ. And so as a result of that, the word evil has been lost into hell and Satan, the devil, Dante's Inferno. Dante's Inferno is our evil. Halloween is our evil, right? The 5-pointed star is our evil. If you really understood the 5-pointed star and its context, just because Anton LaVey put it on a flag behind him when he took his photograph, doesn't mean that that is all about Satanism. There's an element of sacred geometry involved in all that explains the metaphysical aspects of the relationship between man and God. Not something you probably want to study because you've been warned by the pulpit not to look into it. And yet the only ones who came to worship the Messiah when he was born were magi, magicians. So I would be cautious to instantly judge or be afraid of just because you've been told by the pulpit this is what it is. I propose to you that when King James wrote his book, remember this thing way up here? When King James wrote his book, when he translated his book, he had no intention of his vassals, his peasants, and his enemies to change their position. But the scripture seems to indicate that his enemies were just as equal as him. His what? His vassals and his peasants, if they began to walk out the tenets of the kingdom of heaven, or Malchut HaShamayim, the rulership of heaven, then what? They would become kings. Torah promises that you would be politically, financially, and spiritually elite. But you don't even understand what that word spiritual means. So it doesn't benefit him to translate it in such a way that it would say those things. It doesn't benefit the church, whether it be Protestant or Catholic, to tell you that you are actually supposed to become your own pastor, that you are supposed to become your own theologian, that you are supposed to seek, not them, and then tell you how to live. You were told how to live in Torah, but the pulpit tells you to take that as a really nice suggestion. And so as a result of that, now we can understand why the word ra, which is the word evil, has its connection with the messed up mind. What is the messed up mind made up of? Well, we know that the sins of the fathers are visited on the children of the third and fourth generation. Remember that from our generations talk, which means what? There's something inscribed upon our DNA that causes us to what? Think with a limited understanding. Because all sin is a violation of Torah. Torah is a force of benefit for you. Instructions on how to have a better and more effective and more productive life, which of course has been rejected as some sort of burden that weighs down the people that they could never keep, even though that Moses told the people, you can keep it. And don't say you can't keep it. When we are understanding this and when we're starting to get deeper into these things, you need to understand that finally what we're going to have to accept is that the ancient pictographic Hebrew contains information that we need to very carefully and meticulously process that becomes the foundation of your faith. So when we're looking at our word ra, when we're looking at the head twisted or twisted head, then the idea is that we understand that something causes us to think incorrectly. Well, thinking is based upon frames of reference. Somewhere along the line, you started the process of believing a certain way. You either were raised Christian or you later on in life, after living like an absolute mess, decided to try to become healthy. And of course, the church offers a healthier, not healthiest, lifestyle. Fellowship, the study of Scripture. And when we see in Hebrews that the Word of God is living, then we accept that also the study of Scripture seems to enrich our lives. And then we have what? Prayer, which is what? A meditative state in which we express our wishes to a being who supposedly will make it come to pass. Which is relevant because why? Because then we understand that all of those things contribute to a healthier lifestyle, a healthier understanding. So then as we work through the process of our Hebrew word, we need to look at some other things, okay? So let's start at the beginning. So agree with me that a twisted head, at the very least, is a literal turning of the head away from the path that or the direction that you're walking, which is causing you to stop, potentially consider not walking that path anymore, and noticing something that's not on the path. In other words, it's at the very least distracted. At the greater level, it is a problem here. Now, Paul says, be not conformed to the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The idea of your mind changing back. Remember, renewing would be the idea that it needs to change again. But interestingly enough, in the Greek, which we know that letter was probably not written in the Greek, but in the Greek it's metamorpho, doesn't necessarily say renewing. So let's be transformed by a change of mind. A change of mind. So what do we need to change to? Listen, a good 90% of America claims to be Christian, whether they are progressive, conservative, fundamental, traditionalists, whether they're congregational, Episcopalian, or Presbyterian, whether they're non-denominational, whether they're charismatic, or whether they are of the Anglican persuasion. We claim to be Christians. That 90% of America. Okay, maybe it's down to 70 now. I can't remember. Anyways, point being is that a large majority of America claims to be Christian. Now, in that process, then we can conclude that that's how the raising of the children is going to go. That's how the communication about life is going to go. That's how the fundamentals of the culture are going to be present. So in that understanding, then we have to conclude that if there is a transforming of the mind, being not conformed to the ways of this world, number one, we would obviously have to understand what this world was, but also we would have to understand what those transformings were. And now we get to the next and more important part. And if you haven't noticed, we're recapping in depth here, but we're doing that for a reason. Okay, so moving on to our next page. So now what we have is we understand that the Resh is the drawing of a human head. It represents man. It represents the head. It represents the top because it's the highest point on the body, right? So we've got head, we've got top, and we've got man. Now, there's a lot of ways we could go about this because obviously once we start twisting the rope, then we have a twisted head, twisted top, twisted man. Doesn't really quite necessarily always equate to something to do with psychology, but and let me just throw one more minor detail out there. The Greek word psyche, which is where we get the word psyche, means soul. Ology is the study of. Psycheology is the study of the soul. Psychology is the study of the soul. Aptly named, isn't it? Okay, so at any rate, now the next thing that we need to do then is we need to ask what would happen if we added a different letter. So let's just go ahead and we'll add a letter. So let me go ahead and move these down a little bit. Okay, not that much. Okay, and we're just going to add a letter. Well, we saw that earlier, right? And of course, those of you who have been following along with us in the last few months have already gained an understanding that this is the Hebrew parent root for the word light as it is translated into the English as the word light, right? But what we understand is that it actually is in the ancient pictographic Hebrew understanding. In other words, okay, let me say this. This word is, when we combine all of the stems, something to do with order, not light. Okay, something to do with order, not light. And so, of course, we understand that the ancient pictographic Hebrew, so we're just going to draw our ancient pictographic letters here, the Aleph, the Vav, and the Resh, right? Aleph, the Vav, and the Resh. And now we understand that to be order. So going down the rabbit hole a little ways, we're at order, right? We're in the process of taking the red pill, right? All right. But then we have a problem. Light and order have some issues, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But then continuing down, we have what? We have the ancient root as, actually, wait, let's do it this way. We have the ancient root as the ox's head, which meant strong, and what? The human head, which is what? Mind, head, right? Strong mind. So what's the difference between a twisted head and a strong mind, right? That's the question we need to ask ourselves when we're talking about. So what was my first point that I made? They knew more than you think. They understood more than you think. They were metaphysicists. How? They connected the supernatural with the physical and believed that there was inseparability there. Okay? They were nomadic. They were and they were idiomatic. They used symbols to speak. Okay? So when we are talking about the word or, which is this Hebrew word that's behind me, we are talking about let there be light. Okay? So in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, it says, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And he separated the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and he called the darkness night. But what was governing the day and the night? Nothing. Because it's not until verse 13 that we actually get the sun. When we actually get the sun and the moon and the stars, and those are for signs and seasons and years and days. Meaning what? Meaning we need to understand that the word light did not mean light in that third verse, which means King Jimmy, again, has a problem. Well, does it mean order? Possibly, yes. But first we would need to understand what chaos was to a Hebrew. Interestingly enough, chaos was the Mediterranean Sea. My buddy goes swimming out there, and all of a sudden he's done. He disappears. He hadn't been back in 2 weeks. In fact, we're already selling his property. And so basically, there's an understanding that that place is unknown. It's unexplainable. It's tumultuous. There's these huge storms and these tidal waves and all this other junk that happens. And you need to remember that Israel at that time volcanically was insane. And so it had what? Tsunamis. Okay. And so in obviously not tsunamis like what you get in Japan, because where you get the Pacific coming at Japan, but there was still a disturbance of volcanic disturbance in the water, which means this place was insane, right? This place was absolutely insane. Keep in mind also that if we accept that these ancient Hebrews understood this and they intentionally did not dwell by bodies of water, then we can also conclude that there is a process present in which we can accept that this was a fearful thing. So that's their version of chaos, right? Their version of, and of course, unfortunately, I have to use that word because there's really no other way for an English person to understand what I'm saying if I say chaos. Because why? Chaos was actually a Greek mythological character. Okay, but the principle is that there is this complete disorder, supposedly. And light now brings that order. Okay, fine. Well, we can go with that. But there's absolutely no proof anywhere in any physics or quantum mechanics that shows that light causes things to come into stasis. Okay? So if they're flying around, blah, 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 there's nothing telling us that light does that. So finally, at the bottom, we have what? Strong mind. Well, let's talk a minute about a strong mind. When we're dealing with a strong mind in terms of a shepherd, what is something that he does? He is decisive in that he does not tolerate the sheep being disobedient to him, but also he is protective in such a way that he is actually destructive. The violence of a man becomes present when his sheep are under attack by a predator. The violence of a human being comes out when their people who they value or their property who they value is possibly going to be removed or damaged by a predator. They become violent. We call that war, and we call that self-defense. Okay. Now, so the principle is that a strong mind would what? A strong-minded shepherd is going to be decisive in destroying the predator, but then also in deciding where the sheep pasture, where they water, where they relax, and where they shelter at. Okay. A warrior, well, then we get into cowards, right? We get into the man who is not willing to defend. Then we get into the man who is not willing to go to war, not willing to do what he's supposed to do. So we get into cowards, because the strong-minded warrior is going to run into battle even if he's going to die. Okay? And of course, we remember that Yahweh is attributed as a warrior in Exodus 15:15. So we can see where the ancient Hebrews also assigned attributes to God that reflected a strong mind. I'll remind you that the point that I made at the beginning about the idea that they knew more than what you think means that they understood something about the mind, but you need to remember they were metaphysicists. They were not scientific. They were not atheists. They feared God of some sort, and they believed that the supernatural was directly linked into the natural, and that any disorder of that, any dysfunction of that had to do with what? Some sort of interruption of those processes. And so when we get into the faith of Abraham, we get into the understanding of Abraham that he's willing to take 318 men. They're taking them to their deaths. 318 men handled a 50,000, potentially 50,000 man army single-handedly. We even see that with David's mighty men. This was not because there was some extra willpower or extra strength precedent them. They didn't have, a better creatine powder than us. They were metaphysicists. They understood that there was a use of supernatural energy involved in their processes, which we would call the Holy Spirit, which is such an inappropriate connotation to that process, which of course the pulpit has indicated is a person and is a separate person of the triunity of the Godhead, which consequently the word Godhead comes from the Vedas, which is what? Hinduism. Okay, so in that whole process of understanding, then we can accept that this light is the opposite of evil. The strong mind is the opposite of the twisted mind. Okay, so now we go a step further and we ask the next question. What is the point? Why is this important? Because this is an example of where we are seeing the ancient pictographic Hebrew tell a very different story than what is actually written in your King James Version. The only way you could understand that is by looking both at the ancient pictographic Hebrew and understanding the level at which that is more factual and more accurate than a speculative, biased translator. I will remind you again, it is impossible for the King James Version of the Bible to be good because he would not benefit from the truths in the Bible being taught and preached to his peasants, to his vassals, because they would realize that they were kings. They would realize that prosperity was the order of the day. They would realize that they were about to amass wealth. In fact, that the wealth of the wicked was stored up for the righteous. That's what they would have realized. But instead, we have vows of poverty, and we have a promotion that Christ was poor because he didn't have a place to lay his head. No, that's because he was nomadic, not because he was poor. Abraham was able to buy the cave of Machpelah for a certain amount of gold, not because he was poor and had a vow of poverty, because that's humility. That doesn't equate to humility. Do you see the manipulation there? That means you have to have a problem with that book. So then we asked James Strong's, well, James, what do you think? Can we go back to the Hebrew? Can we work with the Hebrew here? No, you can't even ask him why, because he didn't stop. He stopped at the lexical root, as does Theological Seminary, who, of course, is promoting Trinitarianism, antinomianism, anti-Semitism, and, of course, the doctrines of hell and our guy wearing red pajamas with a pointy tail and a pitchfork. Thank you, Dante, for ruining our theology. But the principle is that in all of this, there's an understanding that needs to be had when it comes to understanding good versus evil. Good versus evil. Good versus evil. In our minds, we have concluded that it has to do with the criminality of a human being, or that has to do with the renegade, or the rebel rouser, right? Or the revolutionist. And yet we do find in this social democratic republic that we live in, that there's a promotion of revolution right built into our history. And yet it's not okay for a person to think, speak, or speculate independently about their God, about their life, about the cosmos. It is not okay for a Christian who's sitting in the Sunday pew to go, are you sure that that's what it says in Psalm 82, that we are judges? Because some guy on YouTube said that it says Elohim, which means that we are actually gods. Do you know how that conversation would go with a pastor? Okay, so in that whole thought process, why have I shown you this? Because now you understand that you play a bigger role in the cosmos, and the ancient Hebrews understood that. You play a bigger role in the cosmos than you realize, because whether it says, let there be light, which it doesn't, in fact, there's no remote way that could possibly be interpreted light there. Because again, we don't have our reference in the world of formation of light until verse 13 of Genesis 1, in which the sun, moon, and stars, which is our reference of light. Unless we're using artificial light, LEDs, incandescent bulbs, which are basically something that was recently discovered, so we got to let that go. We're talking about the sun, that thing that stands in the sky, which you yourself can't say anything to. You can't tell it to drop. You can't tell it to stay where it's at. You can't tell it to move. But Isaiah was able to, and so was Joshua. Why? What's the difference between them and you? You need to figure that out. Furthermore, not only that, but can you do anything to add or diminish the amount of power that's coming from that bad boy? You step outside and look at that thing, and you tell me whether or not you really have an understanding of what Abraham understood. Because when Abraham was drawing that line with that circle around it, he already understood tritium and deuterium. that word is never used as the word light. It is used as gather or condense or intensify, which is insane because that's exactly what our God or our Elohim is the intensification of all powers in the universe. Do you know that Hebrew word Elohim means powers? The intensification of all powers, energy. But see, for us who have had our American Christian raising, we're in the realm where he's way out there. We're here. We're insignificant until we die. The only way that we're going to find out the good stuff is if we accept Christ, which preserves us from the hell that Dante created. And consequently, in the process, there's no reference or understanding to the fact that your manipulations, your distortions, your way of thinking, and your biases are damaging humanity. For a moment, consider that the reason why they used these pictographs to describe these things is because at the core of the very existence of decency and order and social justice is a sound mind. A person who has what? Who has an internal locus of control, not an external. What does that mean? That means that they don't need to be controlled. They are in control of themselves. They don't need a speed limit sign because they're smart enough to know how fast you should go down a highway. They don't need information to tell them whether or not they should be kind to somebody, merciful, gentle, kind. Oh, wait a minute. Those are all words in what? The fruit of the Spirit, which is what? Energy, which is what? A connection to the supernatural from where? From the physical, which is what? Metaphysics, which is what? In the pulpit, heresy, New Age. And yet here we have these ancients drawing these pictographs and trying to explain to us who are so ignorant of their enlightenment. We are fools compared to what they knew. I'll remind you of my message during Vayeshev, in which I said, if we really could conclude that Jacob was a deceiver, a heel grabber, that he was a problem child, why in the world is it when he flees from his family? He should have, been brought to justice for his deception. He flees from his family, and the intensification of all power in the universe shows him something that we can't even translate that word, but we've went ahead and just gone with that it's a ladder. A ladder. Go outside, get your ladder from the shed, and tell me how high it goes. And yet we have angels ascending and descending on it, and Jacob gets the privilege of seeing it. That's never happened to you. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what's missing. Ask yourself, what is it that is wrong? And I'm talking about people whose parents were Christians. And now you are a Christian because why? Because you grew up learning about Christianity and probably somewhere in your adult life concluded that you actually needed to be saved, got saved, or at least rededicated. For those of you who got it when you were like 8 years old, rededicated, and now you have begun the journey of a relationship with the intensification of all power in the universe, the almost imperceivable God. We need to tread lightly. We need to have humility, and we need to accept that the ancient pictographic Hebrew is a map. It's information being communicated to us. Why is that so important? Because if you just switch the letter around like this, if you just take and let's see how we do this. We'll go ahead and I will shrink this down. Well, we didn't get all of it. Try that one more time. It might not work to do it this way. Sometimes this touch screen doesn't necessarily respond very well to bigger drawings. Okay, now I think yeah. So we're just going to shrink this down. We're going to move it over here, okay? Because that's our information about light, about a strong mind, about order, depending on what level we're at, right? Okay, and then what? All we do is we switch the letter from Aleph Resh to Resh Aleph, right? And of course, you guys remember what's going to happen here. This is going to be the word in the English translated as sight, appearance, visible information, okay? But what's interesting is we have our same Hebrew letters, which means what? This is still a strong mind. Except now it is mind strong. Either way, what's the coincidence here? The coincidence here is that the way in which sight works by light coming into your eyes and the rods and cones processing depth, right? Contour, lights and darks, shades, right? Stereoscopic vision. So we get two sides of something that makes it three-dimensional. But all of that is information based upon what are observing, what we are seeing in front of us. But again, in the depths, it does not mean sight. It's related to the word light, flipping the letters around, right? It's related to the word light. It's related to the idea of light information coming into your senses and that sensory part of your mind processing that into object recognition. You see things that you know and understand, but if you didn't know the thing and you saw it, you would try to describe it best you could. Meaning what? Some of the stuff the prophets saw, they did the best they could explaining what they saw, but they didn't have words to necessarily describe it, so they used idioms. There's another reason why this is important beyond what you're already gaining here, which is that what? I mean, the gaining is that what you see is not necessarily what you get. We have frames of reference. We have object recognition. I hold an apple up to you. You're going to say apple. I'm going to say what color. You're going to say red or yellow or green or whatever it is. And not only that, but I'm also going to ask you, what's the flavor? Well, that would be a hard one to describe, wouldn't it? It's sweet, right? Sometimes sour. What's the texture? Well, sometimes it's crunchy, sometimes it's grainy, sometimes it's mushy, right? But the taste of applesauce or the taste of apple is distinct. You can't take an orange and say, oh, you know what? This is an apple. Why? Because it doesn't taste the same. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't smell the same. It doesn't feel the same. In other words, our senses have created categories of information in which now there is a compare and contrast. But here's the problem. When it comes to interaction with the supernatural and when it comes to interaction with humanity, we are wrong. You say, wow, that was a big statement. Yeah, it was. Because what you do not have is a guarantee on how a human is going to interact with you. What you have is frames of reference which are assumptions about how a person is going to interact with you. I observed within this week, after the Father began to give me this message, I observed within this week probably maybe 25 different instances from different people in different circumstances in which assumptions were made because the frames of reference were not present that would indicate that that's how a person was going to act. Why? Because we're unpredictable. Now, there is plenty that we are predictable in, but the point that I'm trying to make here is that your perception is not fact. And don't get me wrong, your experience overrides anything that I tell you. You will say, oh, no, I've experienced that this way, and you will throw out what I'm saying. But you need to understand that what I'm trying to tell you is that your perception is based upon all the information that you've gained so far. So it's possible that your perception is creating a very distorted version of reality and of information. Here's the word perception in Hebrew: a strong mind. Why was that important? Why were these ancients communicating to us thousands of years later, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years later? Who knows? That it's a strong mind that sees. Do you get it? There has to be a what? A strong mind in order to operate within the realm of perception and sight. God, this is so important because number one, right off the bat, we are going to look at certain human beings a certain way based upon our previous experience with human beings. You have somebody who remotely represents somebody who's hurt you, and your wound arises and you do damage. Why? Because your wound is a twisted head. A wound is an area in your life where you experience negative emotion, and now you have a frame of reference to that negative emotion in such a way as to create a moment in which you treat another human being in the wrong way because they have triggered your trauma. Your body now is reacting, even though they didn't do it to you, even though that they have not been the problem. You've never, ever experienced the problem from them. They create that context of memory. Remember, memory is context sensitive. They create that context of memory, and all of a sudden you are experiencing the emotion, and all of a sudden they are a problem, and you treat them a certain way when they never did a thing. The same is true of our limiting beliefs. You will have somebody walk up and be like, I'm going to go do this. And you'll be like, you can't do that. And they'll be like, why not? Well, because of this. And you can very easily defeat the vision and potentially the purpose of that human being because of your perceptions. When I say you can't trust information, you need to understand that the information that's coming to you needs to be passed through filters. Needs to be passed through filters that were established by God. Filters that say that you are a high maintenance child of God, meaning there is no other identity. You are not a mother. You are not a daughter. You are not a son. You're not a father. You're not a husband. You're not a coworker. Those are titles. And those are stewardships. But your true identity is that you are of the same origin energy as the intensification of all power in the universe. He is your father. He is your progenitor, right? He is the origin of who you really are, which means what? You are Elohim. You are powers. And that plays a role in this metaphysical universe, which is dangerous for you literalists. And it's dangerous for those of you who have been trying to control the people with religion. because they're going to step out and they're going to become something very different. But not as long as you have limiting beliefs, not as long as you accept what you've been told by everybody else. No, as a high maintenance child of God, that means what? That doesn't mean some valley girl high maintenance who you got to spend all your money on. That means that he spends a lot of time maintaining your condition. The intensification of all power in the universe, Yahweh, God, however you want to call it, makes it its personal mission to make sure you're okay, to make sure that you are happy. Why? That's actually an attribute of his energy, to make sure that you have shalom. Why? Because that's an attribute of his energy. And so when we are working with this and we're working on perception, you need to understand that in the ancients' understanding, energy and matter were the same thing. If we look at the theory of relativity, the E equals mc squared, we've got energy, matter, and light. Come on, people. Is it that hard to get back to a place where that energy has intelligence and that energy has some form of intention? Now, all of a sudden, we have energies that are what? Actual relationship connections to the thing that can breathe those stars, suns, out of its breath, out of its mouth. Meaning what? Meaning that there is a lot more present within you than you accept. You're spending your days treating yourself horribly because you don't understand that you're a king. You don't understand that Yahweh gave you dominion over this earth. When I am working with this understanding, one of the things that I am definitely aware of is the limitations of my mind because of what I have allowed to become the standard of perception, of reality. Not looking at the bigger picture, looking at the suffering, the wounds of my life, and demanding compensation, which is entitlement, which is what? Going to prevent me from being able to be entitled to what I'm really entitled to. See, we spend our days, here's the irony, we spend our days as Christians believing that we are no longer entitled to prosperity because we have stopped being wicked. When the truth is that what gifts God gave you in order to amass wealth, be prosperous, and to have elite processes is present in you as a result of him and not the result of your own ego. The darkness that perpetuated while you were practicing those successes is a very different story. But my point is that all of a sudden you've become a Christian and all you're doing is waiting to die and you're not trying to prosper anymore. And you believe that once Christ has entered your heart, you now have changed, when the truth is in your heart of hearts and in your secret place, you are horribly miserable and loathe yourself. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. And so what are we doing? We're walking around, and what we're doing is we're giving false perceptions. Let me tell you what I mean. You have a person who does not consider themselves worthy of their family, who does not consider themselves competent, who does not consider themselves to be good enough to what? Be a husband or to be a wife or a coworker, right? Or a manager or the owner of a company. In their heart of hearts, they don't feel like they can do it. And yet they present to the world that they can. That is a false identity. That is a deception. That is a mask. That is a manipulation. But a self-actualized human being is going to step forward and they're actually going to be able to do it. Because why? Because they have changed their opinion about themselves. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that's dark. right? They consider themselves something they're not. Paul warns about that. But when you step into the realm of high-minded healthiness, in other words, where you are on a higher level of health than before, you will understand where your identity lies, what you are, who you are, and what you are supposed to do. And we are supposed to be the change that this world needs, not the problem. And so in that process, it becomes absolutely necessary to respect the ancient pictographic Hebrew trying to tell you you are supposed to see with a strong mind, your perception of this world. Let me show you how this plays out. Joseph, because he was younger than the other brothers, while he was being raised by Jacob, because he was born later on, he was the baby, right? And as the baby, he was treated with a little bit more attention and a little bit more respect and a little bit more specialness. And with Jacob's love for Rachel, Joseph was his only connection to her because she was gone, dead. And in that process, then, what we need to do is accept that, well, actually, she may not have been dead at this point. That process is that we need to accept that Joseph was the favored of those, but you need to remember what they've already done. Shechem has already occurred, right? Reuben has already gone up to his father's couch. There are dysfunctional processes with these brothers. Joseph comes along with sight. Sight into something that he didn't understand at that time, and no one understood at that time. And however you want to spin it, you can accept that the world was saved because of Egypt's prosperity during Joseph's rule. And so as a result of that, what we then can conclude is that however it works out, when Joseph saw that first vision of the sheaves, he had a very different kind of sight. All of a sudden, his family comes in and they begin to suppress it and hate him and be jealous of him. I'm going to tell you, when I was early in my Christian walk, before I have my days in which I played Christian, and I have my days when I finally stepped before God and said, okay, you win. Let's do this thing. Well, those days of playing Christian, as it were, one of the things that I used to get jealous about is people's revelation. I was in a charismatic church, Pentecostal, right? Independent Pentecostal, which means it was very fundamentalist. And people believed that revelation was very, very important. So as people were getting words from God, as people were seeing visions, I was jealous and angry and frustrated with those people because why? Because even back then, I could see through the facade. I would go to their home and they were having these visions in the church and speaking in tongues and all these other things. And I would go to their home and there was tension. There was secrets. There was abuse. And I would react to that and think to myself, why do they get the vision and I don't? So I understand that jealousy and I understand that hate. I remember the feeling of going, man, these people don't deserve to even be alive. And they're supposedly getting revelation from God. I didn't understand that. They possibly weren't getting revelation from God. But here's my point. These brothers become jealous of him. Jealous because of the favor he receives from his father. Jealous because of the coat. Who knows if it was jealousy because of the coat. But jealousy, period, right? They become angry with the fact that they're not receiving what Joseph is receiving. And even Jacob becomes reactive to it, which gives them, the children, permission to treat Joseph badly, which then equates to what happens with Joseph as he's moved out. But here's the point. All of that was perception because why? They had a true prophet in front of them. he had already dreamed what was going to happen. He dreamt about wheat, and he dreamt about all of the wheat being brought in and subject to him. Joseph had vision beyond his world of perception. Was he favored by Jacob? Yeah, sure, fine. Was that a factor in why he was sold to the Egyptians? Yes, of course. But what I'm wanting you to understand is the difference between the perception of reality that was in front of them, which was that he was some jerk who was treated with favor, to the reality that was actually in front of them, and that the savior of the known world at that time was standing before them. Remember what I said. We either treat people with the idea that we need to defend ourselves from them because of our wounds and because of our limiting beliefs, or we have worse, the entitlement in belief that we should be allowed to, or that it's okay to exploit them. We treat them as a resource. You ever wore out your welcome? You ever gotten one too many rides from a friend? You ever asked for money one too many times from a friend? That's exploitation based on entitlement, based on manipulation. You ever treated somebody with indifference because of rumors when you've never experienced the person yourself? You've never actually sat down and spoke with that person or listened to what manifestation of God is through them to you? Don't get me wrong. If there's a violation, guys, you remember my message last week about judgment, or about vengeance, or about defending yourself, right? About your enemies and what you're supposed to do with them. All I'm saying is that you need to give people a chance. And I'm also saying that you may not know what you have in front of you. Did anybody in David's family think that in 38 years, something like that. Anyways, in 30 years, he would be passing a crown to his son, who would be the wisest man in the entire world, such as was, so shall never be again, according to the scripture that Yeshua said can't be broken. You do not know who you have in front of you, and you have the nerve to treat them a certain way. You do not know what the Father is doing in a situation. It is very important to understand that this week's parasha is about perception. It's about true sight, metaphysical vision. How in the world can we conclude that Pharaoh, who's not a fearer of God, not even a Noahide follower, in other words, he's following the 9 Noahide laws, or maybe it's 7 Noahide laws. Not even that. This man has a vision that's connected to what's about to happen with the weather, that's connected with what's about to happen to the crops, that's connected to what's about to happen to the livestock, that's connected to what's about to happen to the Nile. That's a connection with the supernatural and the physical. That's a very different kind of sight, isn't it? And so we can accept that this Hebrew word, Resh Aleph, means sight. But we can only accept it if we accept the culture, history, language of the people of God. If you are a people of God, that is your culture, that is your history, and that is your language. America is not your culture, it is not your history, it is not your language. We are in the world and not of it. We are never citizens. Remember, Abraham was never a citizen of any given city. We are never citizens of where we are dwelling. In fact, that was Hitler's biggest complaint about the Jews, is that they live in countries, but they never actually become a part of that country. They consume their resources, they marry our women, they do all these things, right? That was his complaint. But that's the very truth of the nomadic lifestyle. And that's the very existence of a Hebrew. Your connection to people has nothing to do with your citizenship. Your connection to people has nothing to do with your current practice of religion. Your connection to people has to do with how God is manifesting himself to the world through them. And I know that word manifest is probably not the best. How he is showing himself to the world through them. So when you see, you need to see with a strong mind. When you think about order and light, you need to think about a strong mind. When you think about wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlement and a lack of imagination, you need to think about the twisted head. You need to think about the idea that that is causing you to deviate from the natural order process of who you were created to be. There are two references to the strong mind in the word light and in the perception of light. And I can tell you that that right there requires you to heal from your wounds and requires you to lose the limiting beliefs, requires you to step into a humility that you do not deserve anything and you are not entitled to anything. And it requires you to start to use your imagination and stop living in your memories and start living in your imagination, become the future self, become the change that this world needs. And then we get into the thought process of why Yeshua came. Did he come to this world and do what he did so that he could destroy it later on, according to the book of Revelation? No, he did not. He came to this world to give it a chance to change, which means what? He believes it can change. Which means what? Revelation isn't guaranteed. Oh boy, did I just step on some toes. Anyways, the point behind all of this is to understand that these ancient Hebrews, they knew more than you do. And you need to realize that your version of the Bible does not communicate that. And that your version of the Bible does not communicate to you what is needed to be understood. Your culture, your language, and your process of existence right now does not reflect a Hebrew, does not reflect a nomad. And as a result of that, your philosophy, your theology, and your psychology is messed up. Paul said, change it. The ancient Hebrews said, change it. So then we need to change it. We need to let go of this stubbornness. Yahweh wants to do an overhaul. The intensification of all power in the universe wants to make you more like him, wants you to be more powerful than a secular humanist. And I promise you, if you're a Christian and you're reading the book of Acts and you're not extremely uncomfortable with what you're reading compared to what you see in front of you today, then you are a secular humanist. If you read the book of Acts and go, what's wrong? Why do we not have this? Then you're a Hebrew. And I propose to you that even if you have never even heard a Hebrew word, it is your potential and it is your birthright because you were born again into the kingdom of heaven, into the the commonwealth of Israel, according to Ephesians chapter 2. You were brought in, and you were brought in for a purpose, to become the change that this world needs. Remember, the world is basically saying, we'll change when somebody else does. In fact, I have a whole entire category of counseling that I do with people where I help them understand how much it is not everybody else's fault, and that they are actually choosing not to change because this other person won't change, which is an absolute manipulation. The world is to be blamed. Everybody else is to be blamed. We sit here and we say, oh, this current system of things. Oh, this current regime. Oh, this current culture. No, those are not reasons. Those are not reasons to not change. Those are not reasons to create a political entity that would affect change. Those are not reasons to not step forward and begin practicing the things that you actually see in Scripture versus what you're told in the pulpit. You need to become an independent theologian. You need to interpret Scripture for yourself, and you need to investigate for yourself, because I promise you're going to find that you have been so lied to, so deceived. And it's not just Christianity. It's all of the Abrahamic religions. Been so lied to, so deceived, and so controlled by powerful entities that you don't realize what you actually have in front of you when you stand in the mirror. So, what's the importance here? You need to heal, and you need to stop thinking the way you've been thinking, and you will begin to change this world. You will begin to see prosperity and eliteness begin to flow towards you. And my proof is in the fact that on these pottery shards and these ancient cities, that exact message is being communicated back to us thousands of years later. For those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. And in the